Uh, a very good afternoon to you. I am Farid Mirbagheri, Professor of International Relations at University of Nicosia. We are going to discuss a very interesting topic in the context of COVID-19, and that is its particular impact on the Middle East. For this, we have a fantastic speaker and analyst with us, Ambassador Hesham Youssef, a career diplomat with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Egypt. He, for 5 years, from 2014 to 2019, was the Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian, Cultural and Social Affairs of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, OIC, and completed his term in July of 2019. He has served for 13 years. He served as senior official in the Arab League, as official spokesman, and later the Chief of Staff to Secretary General Amr Musa for 8 years, from 2003 to 2011. He was a senior advisor to Secretary General of the Arab League, Dr. Nabil El Arabi, from 2012 to 2014, on issues relating to crisis management as well as reform of the Arab League. Ambassador Youssef has worked extensively on conflict resolution in the Middle East, and in particular, the Arab-Israeli conflict, reconciliation in Iraq, and the situation in Sudan. He has written several papers on reform in the Arab world and focused in the last 5 years on fragility and the humanitarian situation in the Islamic world, in particular in Somalia, the Palestinian territories, Chad, Niger, and Myanmar. Ambassador Youssef joined the Egyptian Foreign Ministry in 1985. He was posted around the world as a diplomat in Canada, Geneva, and the World Trade Organization. He was a member of the cabinet of the Egyptian Minister of Foreign Affairs from 1992 to 1995, and from 1999 to 2001. He has a bachelor's degree in physics from the Faculty of Science, Cairo University in 1980. From 1989 to 1993, he taught at Cairo University, also at the American University in Cairo, and the Lehigh University in Pennsylvania. He holds a master's degree from St. John's College, New Mexico, and the American University in Cairo. Ambassador, welcome.
It's a pleasure to see you, Professor Farid, and I hope to be able to see you in person very soon.
Thank you very much. Thank you, very kind of you. I've had the pleasure of learning and listening to Ambassador on previous occasions around the world. So I know what is lying ahead, and I'm looking very much forward to it. As we said in our introduction, which audience might have seen, the implications of COVID-19, we numbered them. First, it more than ever before emphasizes the importance of technological advancement. Secondly, it highlights the significance of secure borders. Then it also deals and actually gives importance to the question of self-sufficiency in strategic goods, such as wheat or sources of energy. Fourthly, generally the vulnerability to the environment, and whether the natural threats or man-made threats, they have also, as a result of this virus, have concentrated minds. And of course, generally the question of human security, and in particular national security, is being reassessed due to the impact of coronavirus. Now, if I may kickstart the discussion, may I ask Youth Ambassador. This region, sadly, is known in the world for some of the troubles that it has been dealing with. Of late, of course, has been the past decade or so, question of extremism and terrorism. Now, do you think this threat of virus, which is pandemic, it's a threat to the region as well, is it going to somewhat overshadow the extremism that we have been seeing in this region? Will it affect the extremism in any shape or form?
Well, thank you very much, Professor Farid, once again for the introduction and for having this interesting discussion. Let me start by saying that the implications of this pandemic will stay with us for years and perhaps decades. And we are barely in the beginning. So what have passed is only a couple of months. But the implications and the repercussions will stay with us for years and years to come. And of course, this will be dependent on all kinds of things, including whether we'll be able to find a vaccine, and including whether we'll be able to find a cure. And although there is a huge race all over the world to try to find a vaccine and a cure, this is not 100% guaranteed. So we have had all kinds of illnesses before in which we were unsuccessful in reaching a vaccine or reaching a cure for all kinds of diseases. So we have to bear this in mind. And in answer to your question about how this would affect extremism, we have to indicate that extremism is of different natures. So we have extremism that leads to ISIS, extremism and different forms of terrorist organizations, Al-Qaeda and otherwise. And we have extremism in relation to leaning to one direction or another. So it can be extremism to the right, and it can be extremism to the left. And we have seen in Europe, for example, some forms of extremism as well in relation to how the world should deal with migrants, refugees, and so on. And what happened in relation to the pandemic also made this situation worse. As for extremism in particular, when we talk about in relation to terrorism, one of the implications of the pandemic is that you will have, according to the World Food Program, for example, that you'll have 265 million people moving towards starvation by the end of this year. And according to the World Bank, you will have around 500 million people being added to those who are impoverished. So how many of these would choose a path of extremism in a global situation whereby we have all kinds of conflicts and we have those who are trying to ignite these conflicts even further? And we've seen in many places around the world how mercenaries are being used and how extremism from other places is being imported. One of your close neighbors, Libya, is suffering from those who are coming from abroad acting as mercenaries, whether from the region or from beyond. And poverty and unemployment and all these difficulties may result in a trend towards further extremism and heightened problems in relation to extremism. So we will have to see how we can deal with the pandemic in a more effective way, because this will have an impact on extremism.
Thank you for that. By the way, I apologize, I forgot to mention that currently the ambassador is in Washington, D.C., and he's actually a senior fellow at the United States Institute for Peace. I apologize, your illustrious past kind of got me carried away, and I didn't get to this. Ambassador, could this COVID-19 act as a trigger, as a catalyst for cooperation among countries in the region that have traditionally been at odds with one another? I have in particular in mind United Arab Emirates and Israel, who have announced they will cooperate, or they are cooperating on COVID-19. Do you think this could be a trend, or that is just a one-off?
Well, Professor, you're living in Europe, and you have seen early on in dealing with the pandemic, the situation that evolved in Italy, and how Italy was disappointed in feeling that it did not receive the help that it expected from other European countries. And we've also seen countries preventing exports of products that they thought they may need for their own population because of the pandemic. And we've also seen countries even stealing shipments of medical equipment from one another in relation to the pandemic. So we have seen all kinds of difficulties. We have seen countries closing borders, justifiably so, but without cooperation or coordination with neighbors. So we've seen that in countries that have the best of relationships. So imagine what this would entail for countries that are having difficulties in their relations in the first place. So what we have seen, especially at the outset of the pandemic, was rather negative. Of course, countries realized that, if your neighbor keep getting more and more cases of the virus, then this will catch up with you. And you have to be very careful, that you will also have to cooperate. But the pandemic gave arguments and impetus to both sides of the equation. Of those who are saying, no, you have to close borders, globalization is affecting us negatively, and we have to be confined within our borders and rely on ourselves, as you mentioned in your introduction, and self-sufficiency and so on. But then there were those who were saying, no, you can't deal with this pandemic on your own. So you need international cooperation. Which argument would win? I don't know. But this is an ongoing debate, and it will continue because we are not out of the woods yet. We have rising cases in the United States here to levels that are extremely high. Even the United States, the European Union decided to, encourage people from different countries to come to Europe, but not others, including many countries in the Middle East, the United States, and so on. So it remains to be seen how this would affect cooperation and relations between countries. And in relation to the EU, the decision that was taken yesterday as well, it said, okay, we will accept also people visiting from China, but on a reciprocal basis, because China has prevented Europeans from going to China. So there will be all kinds of difficulties and complications. And it is not easy because as a discussion has also started by saying, okay, you're preventing people from coming from some countries, but then there are mixed marriages from many of these places. And we want these families to go back and live together. But then if you're preventing them from coming from some countries, then this would be difficult and so on. So these are the kind of complications that we're facing. And how we're going to deal with that will also depend on how things would evolve. So will the number of cases and those who are catching the virus become reduced, or will it continue to expand and increase? So if it continues to expand and increase, then countries will start taking steps to close back again. And this is happening in some states in the United States. So some states are even requiring those who are coming from states, different states, that have high level of infections to quarantine for 14 days. This is within the United States. So, and of course, this would also probably apply across the globe when you are worried about people coming from Brazil, for example, because the number of cases has risen, or other places where this has been the case, or in dealing with places that countries have evaluated that they have dealt with this situation in a more successful way. And coming to the United Arab Emirates and Israel, we think that any cooperation in relation to dealing with the pandemic is something that has to be encouraged, because we need all the help that we can get in facing this catastrophe that we haven't seen for the last 100 years. So this is not something that we face every day. So the level of cooperation and the effort that is needed from all of us is multiplied many times, manyfold, as a result of the magnitude of this pandemic. So we welcome any cooperation between any countries who feel that this can benefit mankind. But I want to also indicate at the same time that it was only 2 weeks ago or so that the ambassador of the United Arab Emirates, Youssef Al-Ateba, in Washington, D.C., wrote an op-ed article in Yadi'ut Ahranot, sending a message to Israel, saying to them that annexation will affect cooperation and will affect what we were able to achieve, because what we were able to achieve was predicated on encouraging Israel to move on the path towards peace with the Palestinians, to allow normal relations to evolve in this important part of the world. And he warned Israel that annexation will result in a setback in relation to cooperation. So we will see how things evolve. If annexation continues, then this will result in huge difficulties in the region, and perhaps even instability that would be devastating. If wisdom prevails, then perhaps we can benefit from the fact that the Palestinian question that went back on the agenda of the international community is returning, and perhaps we can exert more effort to see how we can put it on a path towards peace rather than on a path towards escalation and instability.
Thank you, Ambassador. Extending that a bit, if I may. Could this virus, which is a challenge nature, by the virtue of its pandemic nature, actually become an opportunity for countries in the region that would otherwise not talk to each other, come together and start cooperation, which could, and I'm asking this, could have spillover effects into other areas?
Well, this brings me to a very important initiative. That's what's made by Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General. He called for a global ceasefire in different places around the world in order for us to focus on the pandemic and dealing with the pandemic. And I know that you follow the situation in different places and conflicts around the region very closely. But if you look at what happened to the situation in the conflicts, the major conflicts that we have in the region, unfortunately, they were not positively affected as a result of the pandemic by countries saying, okay, we have a bigger challenge now. Let's see how we can de-escalate or stabilize the situation in order for us to deal with the pandemic. So we have seen the situation in Libya, for example, getting much worse. And the fighting continued between the two major camps in Libya. We have seen the situation also deteriorate in Yemen. It is not improving. The situation in Syria is not improving. The situation in on the Palestinian front, as we mentioned earlier, we've seen a movement by the Israeli government towards annexation, which would make things much worse. We are seeing tension with Iran that has not abated in relation to the pandemic. We haven't seen a breakthrough or something significant between countries that have not been working together, cooperating in order to deal with either these conflicts or in general to say, okay, now that we have this pandemic, let bygones be bygones and let's see how we can go back to normal relations or stabilize situations or improve situations and so on. I would have expected things to go much better, especially in light of the initiative that was made by the UN Secretary General. But I'm sad to say that I haven't seen something like this happening in a significant way.
Do you think, Ambassador, well, if the Middle East, now I'm very happy to see that we have countries like, I'm talking particularly about the Gulf region, United Arab Emirates and Qatar and others are making fast progress in various fields. But do you think generally that the regions not being as advanced as the Western countries in technology and medical science, will this pandemic focus mind on them investing more of what they have in actually technology and infrastructure work that would give them a say and kind of a status or weight in situations such as this?
Well, that's a very interesting question about how countries and how people will react to the current situation in different ways. You mentioned technology. Technology is one of them. So the question that is on my mind now in relation to this issue is related to young people. And there are two possibilities. As a result of the pandemic, young people may become more interested in science and see what implications a pandemic of that nature has had on the whole world. You know, at one point in time, you had 4 billion people staying at home. So it has huge implications. And we've seen all kinds of mixed signals. So we've seen people respecting more expert opinion and scientists that are credible. But we've also seen all kinds of differences in evaluating all kinds of things. Until today, we're not very clear on how the virus is transmitted. Until today, and there were all kinds of things that we thought were true, and then they turned out to be untrue, and so on. So they were saying, well, it can be transmitted through surfaces and so on for I don't know how many hours. And then they said, no, not really. And then they said young people are immune to a higher degree. Now the majority of cases that are taking place in the United States are in the amongst the young people, and so on. So I don't know whether this would encourage more people to go into science or whether this would make people scared. We've seen also how doctors have been treated. with respect in many places, but they have also been at the front line of the danger. So the number of doctors and nurses and so on who have paid a very dear price with their lives because of their work, this will have also a huge impression on the young people. So will this result in encouraging them to go to science, to medicine, to work of that nature, or will they become more, conservative and more scared, which is justified? And then how will governments act? As you mentioned, will they put more and more money in investing in research and development and in science and in, the world at one point in time when the pandemic started was saying, no, 18 months for a vaccine is a very long time. Technology has to be able to do that faster. And before the pandemic, we thought that we had control of our technology and of our lives. We thought that we had it all. Everything can be resolved with our advancement, our technology, just look at our iPhones and what it is capable of doing today as opposed to things that we witnessed only 20, 30 years ago. So, and we thought that we had it all, only for a pandemic to come and make us feel, much more humble, that all what you know is very limited. And you have to be, you have to deal with many things in a very humble way. And I have to tell you, we're very lucky because this pandemic required us at the end of the day to stay at home. So it's not that we had to go to war or in order to face this threat. We were asked to keep distance, to wash our hands, to stay home, to do some precautions that I think are not that huge. But still, we have over 10 million people who are affected and over 500,000 people dead. So this is a catastrophe of huge proportions, and we hope to be able to overcome this in the near future.
Thank you, Amasu. Before I actually a question or two by the audience, I want to finish my round of questions with this last time. Do you see countries in the region? We know that there is a problem in Iraq, in Lebanon. We know Iran has huge problems with sanctions and the economy is doing terribly. Now, do you think COVID-19 in some countries could actually aid the government in overcoming the difficulties they are facing? Or is it going to exacerbate or make it worse? Is COVID-19 helping them or hurting them, the governments?
Well, I think all the people around the globe has recognized and realized the importance of efficient governance, because mistakes by governments can lead to disasters. There are all kinds of studies, and I'm sure hundreds of studies will be coming in the coming few years about how we could have reduced the number of people who died. And there were all kinds of reports about a soccer game, a football game that took place in one place or another that resulted in a huge increase in the number of cases. Had this or other events been canceled, many countries would have gone through a different path. So the performance of governments have become extremely important. So countries will realize how different governments perform. And this applies across the board, not only in relation to the health system and health policies, but even beyond that. You mentioned something about self-sufficiency. And you mentioned wheat. So I'm an Egyptian, and for us, wheat is life. And there are all kinds of debates in different places around the world about food security. Even Japan at one point in time was having this discussion about what is the percentage of rice that they should produce in order to feel that they are food secure. So issues pertaining to food security will become even more critical. And governments will have to be able to see how they deal with this issue in a more effective way. And current governments will be evaluated on the basis of how they were able to deal with some of these issues. One of these issues, for example, in the last few months, was pertaining to respirators. How many respirators did countries have? How many testing kits did countries have? And, but this time it was respirators. I don't know when we have the next problem or catastrophe or crisis, it may not necessarily be ventilators. So how will governments be prepared? And can they be prepared for different eventualities? I'm not sure that they can. And this goes back to the argument of, no, you need international cooperation in order for this to take place. So if you have a pandemic of that nature, yes, you can close borders, but you still need to cooperate in order to ensure that things do not go out of control and that you help your neighbor, because if Italy had less cases, perhaps other countries in Europe may have had less cases as well. So had you helped Italy at the outset, perhaps the number of those who have been infected in Europe and those who died in Europe may have been less. So this is the kind of thing. So governments, the demands for the performance of governments would be high. But this would be happening at a time when governments are facing all kinds of difficulties. And, you mentioned Lebanon. Lebanon is in the verge of collapse economically and financially. So will they be able to afford a system whereby they can deal with this pandemic, let alone future problems, like the one that you mentioned earlier about the environment, for example? How are we going to deal with the environment? And, will this lead us to become more serious about climate change or not? And we'll soon forget, and so on. So all these are questions that we will have to grapple with because the pandemic has opened the Pandora's box, and these are issues that we will have to deal with as an international community and as different countries and communities all over the world.
It's very encouraging to hear that from you, senior figure in a world serious observer of world affairs, and a senior figure actually amidst international politics, and now residing in Washington. It's very encouraging that, you say about international cooperation is the key to actually dealing with such problems, and you cannot deal with these problems in isolation and on your own. Ambassador, I have had some questions from audience, if I may. One of them is, I'm just reading a comment. They've asked you if you would comment about the Eastern Mediterranean region in particular, and in particular, the partnership between Cyprus, Egypt, and Greece. And the question specifically is, are there any limitations in this partnership? Would you like to comment on that, Ambassador?
Sure. As you were talking about cooperation, and I think all these forms of cooperation are important forms of cooperation, and they have to be advanced. And I think that this part of the world is very closely linked to one another. And we can't afford not to be able to have the closest of cooperation. And I think this is a lesson for all of us. This is a lesson for the East Mediterranean, whether it's Cyprus, Egypt, and Greece, or whether it's others who are trying to advance cooperation. We have, numerous forms of cooperation in the Mediterranean and between the Mediterranean and the EU and in the Middle East and in the Arab world and so on. But we also have to admit that the pandemic has revealed that these links are weaker than we thought they were. So they were weaker than we thought they were in relation to the European Union. And they were weaker than they thought they were also in the Arab world, and so on. So this is a time for reflection in order to see not how to be able to deal with many of these issues alone, but how can we deal with these issues better together. And I think this should have been one of the lessons that Europe should have learned from the problems that it has with issues pertaining to migration. Because unfortunately, Europe dealt with this issue in an unfortunate way. It dealt with this issue by trying, each and every country was trying to see how they can limit the number of people that they get. And of course, those who are in the south of the Mediterranean were getting more than their share, because the rest of Europe was more to the north, and people did not have access to them as much as they had access to those who are in southern Europe and in the Mediterranean. So did Europe learn the lesson? You are a much more closer observer to Europe to tell me whether Europe has learned the lesson or not. I'm not sure that they did, but I hope that they will, because Europe and the European Union will have to self-reflect as to what they have done and what they can do in the future in order to ensure that they are cooperating in a much more effective and efficient way. And this applies also to all kinds of groupings, whether it's in relation to Cyprus, Egypt, Greece, whether it's in relation to other forms of cooperation. I think, and this has to be much more intensified in order for us to be able to deal with future problems that will come. It's not whether or not they will come. No, they will come, because this is the nature of life. We keep facing one problem and one challenge after another. So we have to be prepared. And I think this should be one of the lessons that we should learn from this pandemic. As we were ill-prepared, and we were unable to deal with many issues. Of course, it is unprecedented for the last 100 years, as I mentioned, but still, we could have done better. And we hope that in future crises, we will be able to do much better than we fared this time
around. Thank you, Ambassador. I've been reminded by our moderator that this has to be the last question that I'm going to ask. Amazing, it went so quick. I think, like all good things, it's got to come to an end, but we hope we'll be able to do it again. Let me ask the last question, Ambassador, and that is, well, not related actually to COVID, but anyway, it's a question that they've asked. What is the current situation of Iran-US relations, and how do you see developments in the near future in that regard?
Well, it is, of course, it's not related to COVID, but you see, COVID was part of it as well in the beginning, because when the pandemic started, there were countries that started to call on the US to reduce some of the sanctions in order to allow Iran to deal with the pandemic in a more effective way. And of course, not much has happened. But you also mentioned the United Arab Emirates on a number of occasions. And I want to also mention that the United Arab Emirates only a few days ago sent additional assistance to Iran in order to face the pandemic, despite the difficult relations and challenges in the bilateral relations between the United Arab Emirates and Iran. So we see all kinds of things. But in relation to the US, I think unfortunately, the next diplomatic battle in relation to this issue will be in relation to the question of the expiration in October of weapon embargo on Iran. And there are huge difficulties in the Security Council in relation to this issue. Of course, the United States wants to renew this embargo on selling weapons to Iran, but then there are others who are saying No, this was part of the agreement, the nuclear agreement, and it expires, so it should not be renewed. The United States has a different position, and the battle already started diplomatically, because there are those in the US who feel strongly that this should continue, but then there are those in different places around the world that are saying, no, it should not continue. And we will continue to comply with our agreement that stipulates that this is the time to end this embargo. So there will continue to be difficulties in the relations between the US and Iran, especially that we are entering a phase whereby we have the election in the United States will become much more active, and this will make it also difficult for the administration to be flexible on aspects pertaining to Iran. So we will have to continue to monitor the situation and monitor developments, hoping that we can see an end to the crisis and the difficulties with Iran, but also hoping that Iran would, be more wise in relation to a number of policies and measures that they have been adopting in the last years in order for us to move on a more constructive path.
On which note, Ambassador, thank you very much for your time and sharing your knowledge and wisdom. I hope we'll have the pleasure again. I hope I'll be able to see you again. We have to host you in Cyprus, or if I'm in Washington, to see you there. And I really, really enjoyed that. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Farid. I enjoyed it equally, and I hope that we will continue to meet, if not in person, then virtually at least, and hope to see you either in Washington or back in your esteemed university where I had the pleasure of visiting. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. But then this is also part of the difficulties that we're facing as a result of the pandemic. We have been stranded and prevented from moving and having all kinds of events and conferences and meetings and so on. But I hope that this will not continue in the near future. Thank you again.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank our audience as well for having been with us and for their questions. Marinos is over to you now.